The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan Hospital buzzed overhead as Sophie wiped down the nurse's station for the third time that shift. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, the same pair she'd been wearing for 2 years because new ones weren't in the budget. It was almost midnight, and she still had 4 more hours before her shift ended. Then she'd grab 3 hours of sleep before starting her second job at the clinic across town. 28 years old, and this was her life. 2 jobs, no social life, and a bank account that was always in the red no matter how many extra shifts she picked up. Sophie hadn't been on a date in over a year. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bought herself something nice or went to a movie or did anything that normal people her age did. Every single dollar went to one place: her younger brother's cancer treatment. Tommy was 19, supposed to be in college living his best life. Instead, he was in the oncology ward 3 floors above her, fighting leukemia. Their parents had died in a car crash 3 years ago, leaving Sophie as Tommy's only family. The insurance money had run out within the first year. Now Sophie was drowning in medical bills that kept piling up faster than she could pay them down. She thought about Tommy every single day. His pale face, his brave smile when she visited, the way he pretended he wasn't scared even though they both knew the truth. The doctor said he needed a bone marrow transplant, but that cost money they didn't have. Money Sophie couldn't even dream of making unless she won the lottery. "Sophie Chen, please report to administration immediately." The announcement over the hospital PA system made her look up in confusion. Administration? At midnight. Her heart started racing. Had something happened to Tommy? She dropped the clipboard and ran toward the elevator, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. But when she burst into the administrative office on the 5th floor, Tommy wasn't there. Instead, she found Mrs. Rodriguez, the hospital administrator, sitting behind her desk with an expression Sophie couldn't read. Next to her stood an elderly woman in a designer suit that probably cost more than Sophie made in 6 months. The woman had silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and cold blue eyes that studied Sophie like she was examining a specimen under a microscope. "Miss Chen, please sit down," Mrs. Rodriguez said, gesturing to a chair. Sophie sat, her hands gripping the armrests. "Is my brother okay?" "Your brother is fine," the elderly woman said, her voice crisp and commanding. "My name is Catherine Westbrook. Perhaps you've heard of the Westbrook family?" Sophie shook her head. She didn't follow society news or know anything about rich people. She was too busy trying to survive. Catherine's lips thinned with displeasure, but she continued. "My grandson Daniel Westbrook is a patient here. He's in the ICU on the 4th floor. You've been his nurse for the past 2 weeks." Sophie's mind raced back through her patients. Daniel Westbrook, room 412. The young man who'd been unconscious since before she started her rotation there. Late 20s, heart condition. Always surrounded by the best medical equipment money could buy. She'd barely seen his face beneath all the tubes and masks keeping him alive. "I remember him," Sophie said carefully. "Is there a problem with his care?" "His care is excellent," Catherine said. "The problem is that he's dying. The doctors give him 3 months at most. Possibly less." Sophie's throat tightened. She'd known the patient was critical, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it real. "I'm very sorry," she said quietly. "Sorry doesn't help me," Catherine snapped. Then she leaned forward, her eyes boring into Sophie's. "But you can." Sophie blinked. "I don't understand." What Catherine said next seemed impossible, like something from a movie. She wanted Sophie to marry Daniel, her dying grandson. The wedding would happen within the week, right there in the hospital. Sophie would become Mrs. Westbrook, sit by his bedside, and play the role of the devoted wife until he passed away. In exchange, Catherine would pay Sophie $5 million immediately. Sophie's entire body went numb. $5 million. She couldn't even imagine that much money. It would save Tommy. It would save everything. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why me?" "Because you need money desperately and you're already his nurse. It's convenient. The family needs Daniel to be married before he dies for certain legal and business reasons that don't concern you. You need money to save your brother. This is a transaction, nothing more." Sophie's mind was spinning. Marry a dying man she'd never even spoken to? Become a widow before she'd ever really been a wife? It felt wrong on every level. "There are conditions," Catherine continued, pulling out a thick legal document. "You'll remain part of the Westbrook family for 1 year after his death. You'll attend family functions, Play the role of the grieving widow and maintain the appearance that this was a real marriage. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you'll never tell anyone the true nature of this arrangement." Sophie's hands trembled as she stared at the contract. "This is insane." "This is business," Catherine corrected coldly. "You have 24 hours to decide. But know this, Miss Chen. Your brother's doctors tell me he has perhaps 4 months before his condition becomes untreatable. This money would transfer to your account the moment you sign the marriage certificate. You could start his treatment the very next day." Sophie felt like she couldn't breathe. Catherine knew about Tommy's timeline. She'd researched everything. This wasn't a random offer. This was a calculated move by a woman who knew exactly how desperate Sophie was. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke. "Sophie, you don't have to do this. This is highly unusual, and I want you to know that whatever you decide, your job here is secure." But Sophie barely heard her. All she could think about was Tommy, his smile, his laugh, the way he used to joke around before he got sick. He was only 19. He had his whole life ahead of him, and she was the only one who could save him. "I need to think," Sophie managed to say. "Of course," Catherine said, standing up. "You have until tomorrow at midnight. After that, the offer expires, and I'll find someone else." Sophie left the office in a daze. She went through the rest of her shift on autopilot, her mind a million miles away. When her shift ended at 4 in the morning, she didn't go home. Instead, she went up to the oncology ward and sat by Tommy's bed watching him sleep. He looked so young, so fragile. The chemotherapy had taken his hair, and his skin had that awful gray tint that scared her every time she saw it. But he was fighting. Every single day he was fighting to live. Could she really marry a stranger? A dying man she'd never even had a conversation with? Could she sell herself like that, even to save the person she loved most in the world? Sophie watched the sun rise through the hospital window, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, beautiful and completely indifferent to her impossible choice. By the time Tommy woke up, Sophie had made her decision. She kissed his forehead, told him she loved him, and walked out of the room with tears streaming down her face. That night, she returned to the administrative office. Catherine was there, waiting, the contract laid out on the desk like a trap. Sophie picked up the pen. Her hand shook so badly she could barely write, but she signed her name on every page. Catherine smiled, a cold expression that never reached her eyes, and countersigned as witness. "Welcome to the family, dear," Catherine said. 3 days later, Sophie stood in room 412, wearing a simple white dress that the Westbrook family had provided. A hospital chaplain read from a small book. Catherine watched from the corner. 2 nurses served as witnesses, both looking uncomfortable, and in the bed, unconscious and hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, lay Daniel Westbrook. Her husband, a man whose voice she'd never heard, whose eyes she'd never seen open, whose hand felt cold and lifeless when she slipped the wedding ring onto his finger. "You may kiss the groom," the chaplain said quietly. Sophie leaned down and pressed her lips gently to Daniel's forehead. The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to the bizarre ceremony happening around them. When she straightened up, there was a gold band on her own finger. Heavy and expensive, a chain disguised as jewelry. Catherine handed her a phone with a banking app already open. Sophie looked at the screen and saw more zeros than she'd ever imagined in her entire life. She'd done it. She'd saved Tommy, and she'd sold her soul to do it. That night, the wire transfer completed. Sophie sat in Tommy's room and told him they could start the transplant process immediately. She'd gotten a loan, she lied. Everything was going to be okay. Tommy cried with relief and hugged her so tight she thought her ribs might crack. He had no idea what she'd just done, what she'd sacrificed, what she'd become. Mrs. Daniel Westbrook, wife to a dying billionaire, a bride who'd never even seen her husband's eyes open. Sophie went home to her tiny apartment that night and cried until she had no tears left. Tomorrow, her new life would begin, but tonight, she let herself mourn the person she used to be. The girl who'd believed in love and fairness and happy endings, that girl was gone. In her place was someone who'd learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes survival means sacrificing everything you thought you'd never give up. Sometimes love means making choices that break you, and sometimes the price of saving someone is losing yourself completely. 2 weeks passed, and Sophie felt like she was living in 2 different worlds. During the day, she was still just Sophie Chen, the exhausted nurse working double shifts and visiting her brother during every break. But now there was a massive diamond ring on her finger that she had to hide under latex gloves, a ring that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. At night, she would slip into room 412 and sit beside Daniel's bed. She'd talk to him even though he couldn't hear her. It felt less lonely that way. She'd tell him about her day, about the funny thing one of the other nurses said about how Tommy's color was getting better since they'd started the new treatment. Sometimes she'd read to him from books she found in the hospital library. Mystery novels, mostly. She figured if he could hear anything at all, he might appreciate a good story. The other nurses whispered about her. They'd seen the wedding. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. The poor nurse who married the dying billionaire. Some thought it was romantic. Others thought it was suspicious. Sophie avoided their eyes and focused on her work. Catherine called her twice during those 2 weeks. Cold, brief conversations where she reminded Sophie of her obligations. There would be a press announcement soon. Sophie needed to be ready to play her part. The grieving wife-to-be, the woman who'd fallen in love with a man fate was cruelly taking away. Sophie practiced her sad smile in the bathroom mirror. She practiced saying "my husband" without her voice cracking. She was becoming an actress in a play she never auditioned for. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning. Sophie had just started her shift when she went to check on Daniel. It was routine. Check his vitals, adjust his IV, make sure all the machines were functioning properly. She'd done it 100 times before. But this time, when she reached for his wrist to check his pulse, his fingers moved. Sophie froze. She stared at his hand, wondering if she'd imagined it. The machines beeped steadily, same as always. But then his fingers twitched again, more deliberately this time. Her heart started pounding. "Daniel?" she whispered. His eyelids fluttered. Sophie's hands shook as she pressed the call button. "I need Dr. Pierce in room 412 immediately." Her voice came out high and breathless. She turned back to Daniel just as his eyes opened. They were green, deep green like a forest, and they were looking right at her with a clarity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Hi," he said, his voice rough from weeks of not being used. Sophie couldn't speak. She just stared at this man who was supposed to be dying, who was supposed to stay unconscious until he slipped away quietly. But he was awake. He was looking at her. He was alive in a way the doctors said was impossible. Dr. Pierce burst through the door with 2 other doctors right behind him. They swarmed around Daniel's bed, checking monitors, shining lights in his eyes, asking him questions. Sophie backed away into the corner, her mind spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. Daniel was supposed to die. That was the whole arrangement. She was supposed to be a widow, not a wife. The medical team worked for over an hour. They ran test after test, each one coming back with results that made them shake their heads in disbelief. Daniel's heart function had improved dramatically. His vitals were stronger than they'd been in months. Whatever treatment they'd been trying, whatever experimental medication he'd been on, it had suddenly started working. Dr. Pierce kept saying the word miracle over and over again. Catherine arrived within the hour, her heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor. She swept into the room like a queen entering her throne room. When she saw Daniel sitting up in bed, actually sitting up and talking, something flashed across her face too quickly for Sophie to read. "Grandmother," Daniel said, his voice still weak but getting stronger. "Daniel, my boy." Catherine moved to his bedside, and for the first time since Sophie had met her, the old woman's face showed genuine emotion. She took his hand and her eyes were actually wet with tears. "We thought we'd lost you." Over the next few hours, Sophie watched from the doorway as the Westbrook family descended on the hospital. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all dressed in expensive clothes and wearing expensive watches. They cried and hugged Daniel and thanked God for the miracle. None of them paid any attention to Sophie until Catherine called her into the room. "Daniel," Catherine said, her voice returning to its usual crisp tone. "There's something you need to know. While you were unconscious, we made certain arrangements. Legal arrangements that were necessary given your condition." Daniel looked confused. His eyes moved from his grandmother to Sophie, who stood frozen near the door. "This is Sophie Chen," Catherine continued. "She's been your nurse. And 2 weeks ago she became your wife." The room went completely silent. Every member of the Westbrook family turned to stare at Sophie. She felt like a bug under a microscope. Daniel's green eyes locked onto hers. "My wife?" Sophie's mouth was dry. She nodded, unable to find her voice. "We married you in the hospital," Catherine explained. "It was necessary for legal reasons involving the company and your estate. Sophie agreed to help us. She's been very cooperative." The way Catherine said cooperative made Sophie feel sick, like she was a business transaction, not a person, which she supposed was exactly what she was. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, still looking at Sophie. She couldn't read his expression. Was he angry? Disgusted? Confused? All of the above? "I see," he finally said. Then he turned to his grandmother. "I'd like to speak with my wife alone, please." The family filed out reluctantly, whispering among themselves. Catherine was the last to leave, giving Sophie a warning look that clearly said, "Don't mess this up." When the door closed, Sophie and Daniel were alone for the first time with him actually conscious. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "So," Daniel said, his voice still rough, "you married me while I was dying." "Your grandmother asked me to," Sophie said quietly. "She said you needed to be married for business reasons. And she offered me money." "How much?" Sophie's cheeks burned with shame. $5 million, Daniel let out a long breath. He looked down at his hand, at the gold wedding band on his finger that matched hers. "That's a lot of money." "My brother has cancer," Sophie blurted out. "He needs a bone marrow transplant. I couldn't afford it. I was desperate. Your grandmother knew that and she used it. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'd do it again to save Tommy. I'm sorry you woke up and got stuck with me as a wife. I know this isn't what you wanted." She was crying now, hot tears running down her face. All the stress and fear and guilt from the past 2 weeks came pouring out. She turned toward the door, ready to run, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Wait." Sophie froze. "Come here," he said, and his voice was gentler than she expected. She turned back slowly and walked to his bedside. Up close she could see how thin he was, how pale. But his eyes were kind. Tired and confused, but kind. "What's your brother's name?" "Tommy, he's 19. "And the treatment? Is it working?" Sophie nodded. "He's responding well. The doctors are optimistic." Daniel was quiet again, studying her face. "My grandmother is good at finding people's weak spots and exploiting them. I'm sorry she did this to you. To both of us. It's not your fault. You were unconscious." "Still?" He shifted in the bed, wincing. "I suppose we're in an interesting situation now. You married a dying man and he inconveniently survived." Despite everything, Sophie felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That's one way to put it. Here's what I know," Daniel said. "I was supposed to die. The doctors told me months ago that there was almost no chance. I made my peace with it, but somehow I'm still here. And apparently I have a wife I've never met, a wife who saved her brother's life by marrying a stranger. I know it sounds terrible when you say it like that. It sounds like you love your brother very much." Daniel's green eyes were steady on hers. "It sounds like you were willing to sacrifice your own happiness to save him." "That's not terrible." "That's actually pretty incredible." Sophie didn't know what to say to that. "I'm very tired," Daniel continued, "and honestly my head is spinning from all of this. But I don't think I'm angry at you. Confused, yes. Overwhelmed, definitely. But not angry. You didn't hurt me. You were trying to help your family. What do we do now?" Sophie asked quietly. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I guess we figure it out together. After all, we're married. Might as well get to know each other." Over the following days, Sophie continued to visit Daniel's room, but now their conversations were real. He asked her questions about her life, and she answered honestly. She told him about growing up with Tommy, about losing their parents, about the years of struggle. He listened without judgment, sometimes holding her hand when she got emotional. Daniel told her about his life, too. About being raised to run Westbrook Industries from the time he could walk. About the pressure and expectations. About how getting sick had been terrifying but also in a strange way freeing. For the first time in his life, no one expected anything from him except to survive. "But I didn't survive," he said one evening. "Or I wasn't supposed to. The doctors were sure. And honestly, I felt it too. I could feel myself slipping away." "What changed?" Sophie asked. "I don't know. The last thing I remember is lying in this bed feeling like I was drowning. Everything was dark and cold. And then I heard your voice." Sophie's breath caught. "My voice?" "You were reading to me. Some mystery novel about a detective. I couldn't open my eyes or move, but I could hear you. And I thought, that's a nice voice. I'd like to hear how the story ends." He smiled at her and it transformed his whole face. Guess I had a reason to wake up after all. Sophie felt something shift in her chest. Something warm and unexpected and absolutely terrifying. Because this was supposed to be business. A transaction. Not something real. But when Daniel smiled at her like that, when he held her hand and listened to her stories and thanked her for staying, it started to feel very real indeed. And that scared her more than anything else had so far. Because falling for your dying husband who had miraculously survived was definitely not part of the plan. 3 months after Daniel woke up, Sophie found herself standing in front of a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. White columns, perfectly manicured gardens, a circular driveway with a fountain in the middle. This was supposed to be her home now, Catherine had insisted. Daniel was being discharged from the hospital, and it would look suspicious if his wife didn't live with him. They had to maintain appearances. The press had already picked up the story of the devoted nurse who'd married her patient, and now the whole city was watching their fairy tale romance. Except it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a lie that was getting more complicated by the day. Sophie's entire life fit into 2 suitcases. She stood in the grand foyer feeling completely out of place in her jeans and old sneakers. A woman in a crisp uniform appeared and introduced herself as Helen, the head housekeeper. She smiled politely, but Sophie could see the judgment in her eyes. The staff knew she didn't belong here. "Mrs. Westbrook, let me show you to your rooms," Helen said. Sophie followed her through hallways filled with artwork that probably cost more than her childhood home. They walked for what felt like forever until Helen stopped in front of a door at the far end of the West Wing. "These are your quarters," Helen said, opening the door to reveal a suite that was bigger than Sophie's entire apartment had been. "Mr. Westbrook's rooms are in the East Wing. If you need anything, just press the button by the bed." Sophie nodded, trying not to show how overwhelmed she felt. Helen left and Sophie sat on the enormous bed, feeling more alone than she had in her tiny studio apartment. At least there, everything had been hers. Here, she was a guest in someone else's life. That night, dinner was served in a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people. Sophie sat at one end, Daniel at the other, so far apart they practically needed phones to talk. A butler served food that Sophie couldn't even pronounce. She picked at her plate, missing the cheap takeout she used to eat standing up in her kitchen. "This is ridiculous," Daniel said suddenly, his voice echoing in the huge room. Sophie looked up. Startled, Daniel stood, grabbed his plate, and walked down to where she was sitting. He pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "That's better. I felt like I needed binoculars to see you." Sophie couldn't help but smile. "It is kind of ridiculous." "Welcome to my world," Daniel said, "where everything is expensive and nothing feels normal." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Daniel said, "I know this is strange, living here pretending to be a real married couple, but we can make our own rules, at least when it's just us." Over the following weeks, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Daniel spent his mornings in physical therapy, regaining strength after months in the hospital. Sophie enrolled Tommy in the best cancer treatment facility in the state and visited him 3 times a week. In the evenings, she and Daniel would have dinner together, usually in the smaller breakfast room instead of the formal dining room. They'd talk for hours. Sophie learned that Daniel loved old movies and terrible jokes, that he'd never been allowed to choose his own path in life, that he played piano beautifully but only when he thought no one was listening, that he was kind to the staff in a way that suggested he understood what it was like to feel powerless. Daniel learned that Sophie was terrible at keeping plants alive but kept trying anyway, that she sang off-key in the shower, that she was brilliant with numbers and had dreamed of becoming a doctor before life got in the way, that she had a fierce, protective love for her brother that reminded him of the kind of loyalty he'd always wanted but never had. They became friends. Real friends. And that made everything so much harder, because Catherine had other plans. She started booking them for charity events and galas, places where they had to dress up and smile for cameras and pretend they were madly in love. Sophie hated every second of it. The first event was a nightmare. Catherine had sent over a stylist who put Sophie in a dress that cost more than she used to make in 6 months. Navy blue silk that felt like water against her skin. The stylist did her makeup and hair, and when Sophie looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Daniel was waiting at the bottom of the stairs in a perfectly tailored suit. When he saw her, his eyes widened. "Wow," he said softly. "You look beautiful." Sophie's cheeks burned. I feel like I'm wearing a costume. We're both wearing costumes, Daniel said, offering his arm. But at least we're in this together. The gala was held at a museum downtown. Hundreds of wealthy people in expensive clothes, drinking champagne and making small talk. Sophie felt like everyone was staring at her, judging her, knowing she didn't belong. Daniel's ex-girlfriend was there, a stunning woman named Victoria, who looked at Sophie like she was something stuck to her shoe. "So you're the little nurse who trapped Daniel," Victoria said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How convenient that you were there when he was at his most vulnerable." Sophie felt like she'd been slapped. Before she could respond, Daniel appeared at her side. "Victoria," he said coolly, "always a pleasure. If you'll excuse us, my wife and I were just leaving." He took Sophie's hand and led her through the crowd and out onto a balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air felt good after the stuffiness inside. "I'm sorry about her," Daniel said. "Victoria and I dated years ago. My grandmother picked her. It didn't work out." "She's right, though," Sophie said quietly. "I did trap you. Maybe not intentionally, but that's what happened." "You saved your brother's life," Daniel said firmly. "And honestly, waking up married to you has been the best thing that's happened to me in years. Before I got sick, my life was nothing but board meetings and obligations and people who only cared about my last name. You talk to me like I'm a real person. You laugh at my bad jokes. You don't want anything from me except to just be myself." Sophie looked up at him and something passed between them. Something electric and terrifying. They were standing very close and she could see gold flecks in his green eyes. "Sophie," he said softly, and the way he said her name made her heart skip. But before anything could happen, someone called out that it was time for the speeches. The moment shattered and they went back inside, back to playing their roles. That night, Sophie lay in her enormous bed staring at the ceiling. She was falling for him, actually falling for her fake husband. This was supposed to be temporary, a business arrangement. But somewhere between the hospital room conversations and the quiet dinners and the way he made her feel like she mattered, it had become real for her. And that was dangerous. Because what if it wasn't real for him? What if he was just being kind? What if, when the year was up and she could leave, he'd be relieved to get his life back? The next few weeks were torture. Every time Daniel smiled at her, every time he took her hand at a public event, every time he said something that made her laugh, Sophie fell a little bit harder, and she hated herself for it. Then one night everything changed. They were in the library, one of Sophie's favorite rooms in the house. It was smaller, cozier, filled with books and comfortable chairs. Daniel was teaching her to play chess. "You're getting better at this," he said, studying the board. "You're just letting me win," Sophie accused. "Maybe," he admitted with a grin. Then his expression turned serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. If you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would you still agree to marry me?" Sophie thought about it. About Tommy getting better. About living in this beautiful house. About getting to know Daniel. About falling in love with someone who probably didn't love her back. "Yes," she said honestly, "I would." "Would you want me to?" Daniel reached across the chessboard and took her hand. "Sophie, I need to tell you something. These past few months, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's been the best part of my recovery. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me want to be better. And I know this whole situation is complicated and messy, but The library door burst open. Catherine stood there, her face pale. "Daniel, we need to talk. Now. In private." The coldness in her voice made Sophie's blood run cold. Daniel squeezed her hand once before letting go. "I'll be right back," he promised. But Sophie had a terrible feeling that whatever Catherine wanted to say was going to change everything. She sat alone in the library, staring at the abandoned chess game, and tried not to think about the words Daniel had been about to say. Words that might have been exactly what she desperately wanted to hear. Or words that would break her heart. She waited for an hour, then 2. Finally, she went upstairs to her room, that terrible feeling growing stronger with every step. Something was wrong, very wrong, and Sophie had a sinking suspicion that the fairy tale she'd been foolish enough to start believing in was about to come crashing down around her. She'd learned a long time ago that happy endings were for other people. People who didn't have to sell themselves to save their families. People who didn't fall in love with men they could never really have. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. Sophie couldn't sleep that night. She kept replaying the look on Catherine's face when she'd burst into the library. Something about it had been off. Not just angry or annoyed, but almost panicked. And Daniel hadn't come back to finish their conversation. The next morning, Sophie went looking for him. The house was so big that she got lost twice before finally finding him in his study, staring at his computer screen with an expression she couldn't read. "Hey," she said softly from the doorway. "You okay?" Daniel looked up, and for a second something flashed across his face. Fear, anger, but then he smiled and it was gone. "Yeah, sorry about last night. Grandmother had some business emergency. You know how she is." But Sophie did know how Catherine was, and business emergencies didn't usually make Daniel look like he'd seen a ghost. Over the next few days, Daniel became distant. Not cold exactly, but distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. He still had dinner with Sophie, still asked about her day and Tommy's progress, but something had shifted. The warmth between them had cooled, and Sophie didn't know why. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter. This was fake anyway, a business arrangement. But it hurt more than she wanted to admit. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, everything fell apart. Sophie had finished visiting Tommy and was heading back to the mansion early. She'd forgotten her phone that morning and wanted to grab it before dinner. The house was quiet. Most of the staff had the afternoon off, and Daniel was supposed to be at a business meeting downtown. As Sophie walked past Catherine's study, she heard voices inside. The door was slightly open, and she was about to walk past when she heard her own name. "The girl is becoming a problem," Catherine said, her voice cold and sharp. "Daniel is getting attached to her." Sophie froze. Her heart started pounding. "That was always a risk," another voice said, a man's voice that Sophie didn't recognize. "But you got what you needed. He survived long enough for the merger to go through." "Barely," Catherine snapped. If Dr. Reynolds hadn't administered the antidote when he did, Daniel would have died before the wedding. The timing was too close. Sophie's blood turned to ice. "Antidote? What antidote?" "The poison worked exactly as you planned," the man continued. "Slow enough that no one suspected anything. Everyone thought it was his heart condition. And now that he's recovered, the company is secure under your control for another 5 years at least." Sophie couldn't breathe. Poison. Catherine had poisoned Daniel. His own grandmother had been killing him. "The problem is Sophie," Catherine said. "I thought she'd stay in her place, play the grateful little nurse, and keep quiet. But Daniel is falling for her. Real feelings complicate things. If she stays around too long, she might start asking questions. So get rid of her. Pay her off. Send her away. It's not that simple. Daniel will fight for her. He's already asked me about ending the restrictions on their marriage, about making it real. The boy has always been too sentimental." Sophie's hands were shaking. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and started recording. She didn't know if it would even pick up the sound through the door, but she had to try. "What about the brother?" the man asked. "You could use him as leverage." "I've considered it," Catherine said, and Sophie's heart stopped. "The treatment facility he's at, I could pull some strings. Make it seem like his insurance isn't valid anymore. Would take months to sort out, and the boy doesn't have months without treatment. Sophie would do anything to protect him. Even leave Daniel. Sophie had heard enough. She backed away from the door silently, her whole body shaking. She made it to her room and locked the door before collapsing on the bed. Catherine had poisoned Daniel. Had kept him sick and dying so she could control the company. And now she was threatening to destroy Tommy's treatment to keep Sophie quiet and get her away from Daniel. For a long time, Sophie just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it all. The woman who'd hired her to marry her dying grandson had been the one making him die in the first place. It was so twisted, so evil, that Sophie's mind could barely process it. She looked at her phone. The recording was there, but it was muffled. She could barely make out the words. It wouldn't be enough to prove anything in court, but it was something. Sophie spent the rest of the afternoon in her room thinking. She had two choices. She could tell Daniel everything, and together they could try to expose Catherine. But Catherine had money, power, and lawyers. She'd find a way to twist it around, make Sophie look like the liar, and in the meantime she'd destroy Tommy's treatment, or Sophie could stay quiet, protect her brother, let Catherine win. But that meant living with the knowledge that Daniel's own grandmother had tried to kill him. It meant watching Daniel trust someone who'd poisoned him, It meant being complicit in the whole sick game. Both choices felt impossible. That night at dinner, Sophie could barely look at Catherine, who sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court. She smiled at Sophie, that cold, calculating smile, and asked about Tommy's progress. "He's doing well," Sophie managed to say. "The doctors are very pleased." "Wonderful," Catherine said. "Such a blessing that he has access to such excellent care." The threat was clear. Sophie understood. Behave or Tommy loses everything. After dinner, Daniel walked Sophie to her room. At the door, he took her hand. "You've been quiet today," he said. "Everything okay?" Sophie wanted to scream. Wanted to tell him everything. But when she opened her mouth, all she could think about was Tommy. Weak and sick and dependent on treatment that Catherine could take away with a single phone call. "Just tired," she lied. "Long day." Daniel studied her face. "Sophie, if something's wrong, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." And that's when Sophie broke. Not crying, but something deeper. Because she couldn't tell him. Couldn't drag him into this and risk everything. Couldn't let him know that his own grandmother had tried to kill him. Because what would that knowledge do to him? "He'd already lost so much. I'm fine," she whispered. "Really?" But Daniel didn't let go of her hand. "The other night in the library, I was trying to tell you something." "Daniel, don't—" "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words rushing out. "I know this whole situation is crazy. I know we got married for the wrong reasons. But somewhere along the way, it became real for me. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Sophie, and I needed you to know that." Sophie felt like her heart was being ripped out of her chest, because she loved him too, had loved him for weeks now. But loving him meant protecting him, even if it meant destroying any chance they had together. "I can't do this," Sophie said, pulling her hand away. "This was supposed to be temporary. A business deal. We both knew that. But it's not anymore," Daniel said. "At least not for me. Tell me you don't feel it too." Sophie forced herself to look him in the eyes, forced herself to lie to the person she loved most in the world besides Tommy. "I don't. I'm sorry, Daniel. You're a good person and you've been kind to me, but I don't love you. I can't." The hurt on his face was like a knife to her gut. He took a step back and Sophie watched something die in his eyes. The warmth, the hope, the possibility of them. "I see," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I misread things. It's not your fault. I should have been clearer from the start. This was always just an arrangement for me." Daniel nodded slowly. "Right, an arrangement. I understand. Good night, Sophie." He walked away and Sophie barely made it into her room before she collapsed. She cried until she couldn't cry anymore, curled up on the bathroom floor so no one would hear. She'd saved Daniel by breaking his heart, saved Tommy by sacrificing any chance at happiness for herself. And she'd have to live with that choice for the rest of her life. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel avoided her. When they had to appear together in public, he was polite but distant. The easy warmth between them was gone, replaced by awkward silence. Sophie spent most of her time at the treatment facility with Tommy, who was getting stronger every day. But Sophie was dying inside. She'd wake up in the middle of the night replaying that recording, trying to decide if she'd made the right choice. Catherine watched her with those cold eyes, satisfied that Sophie had learned her place. Then Sophie made a decision. She couldn't tell Daniel, couldn't risk Tommy's treatment. But she could start gathering evidence. Real evidence. She started paying attention to Catherine's schedule, to the people who visited her, to the locked desk drawer in her study. She started taking pictures of documents when no one was looking, recording conversations through doors. It took 3 weeks, but Sophie built a case. Not enough for court, maybe, but enough that someone would have to investigate. Enough to prove that Catherine Westbrook had poisoned her own grandson and threatened a sick teenager to cover it up. The question was, what would she do with it? And how much was she willing to lose to expose the truth? Because Sophie had learned something important over these long, painful weeks. She'd learned that sometimes love means sacrifice, sometimes it means making impossible choices, and sometimes it means being willing to lose everything to protect the people you love. Even if they never knew what you gave up for them, even if you had to break your own heart to save theirs. Sophie spent 2 more weeks gathering evidence. Photos of documents, recordings of phone calls, a paper trail that connected Catherine to Dr. Reynolds, the specialist who'd been administering the poison disguised as treatment. Every piece of evidence felt like a small victory, but also like a ticking time bomb. The hardest part was facing Daniel every day. He barely looked at her anymore. When they had to appear at events together, he played his part perfectly. The devoted husband. But his eyes were empty when he looked at her, and Sophie knew she'd killed whatever feelings he'd had. It was worth it, she told herself. Tommy was getting better. Daniel was safe from his grandmother's schemes. That had to be enough. Then Catherine made her move. It started with a casual conversation at breakfast. Catherine, Daniel, and Sophie sat at the table while staff served coffee and pastries. Catherine dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said, "Sophie, dear, I've been thinking. You've fulfilled your obligation beautifully. The year is almost up. Perhaps it's time we discussed your exit arrangements." Sophie's heart stopped. Daniel's head snapped up. "Exit arrangements?" he asked. "Well, yes," Catherine said smoothly. "The marriage contract specified 1 year. That year is almost complete. Sophie has been compensated generously. Surely she's eager to return to her own life. Start fresh." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's Sophie's decision." "Of course," Catherine agreed. "I'm simply saying the option is there. In fact, I've prepared a very generous severance package. An additional $2 million if Sophie agrees to a quiet, uncontested divorce. She could start over anywhere she wants. Her brother's treatment would continue to be fully funded through a trust I'd establish." Sophie understood. Catherine was buying her silence and her absence. Permanently. "I need to think about it," Sophie said quietly. Catherine smiled. "Of course, dear. Take your time. But not too much time." That night, Sophie made her decision. She couldn't keep living this lie. Couldn't keep pretending while Catherine got away with attempted murder. And she couldn't leave Daniel unprotected even if he hated her. She called the one person she thought might help. Daniel's lawyer, Richard Chen, who she'd met at several family functions. He'd always seemed kind, and more importantly, he seemed to genuinely care about Daniel. They met at a coffee shop across town. Sophie brought everything. The recordings, the photos, the documents. Richard listened to it all, his face growing paler with each piece of evidence. "This is serious," he said when she finished. "If this is real, Catherine could go to prison." "It's real," Sophie said. "But she's threatened my brother. If I expose her, she'll destroy his treatment." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "What if we could protect your brother first? Set up an irrevocable trust that even Catherine couldn't touch, then bring this to the authorities. Can you do that?" "I can try. But Sophie, you need to tell Daniel. He deserves to know the truth." Sophie's hand shook around her coffee cup.
"He hates me."
"He thinks I never cared about him. Then tell him why you pushed him away. Tell him everything." It took 3 days for Richard to set up the trust for Tommy. 3 days during which Sophie barely ate or slept. Catherine was watching her closely now, suspicious. Daniel continued to avoid her. Finally, Richard called. "It's done. Your brother's treatment is secured. Nothing Catherine does can touch it now. It's time to tell Daniel." Sophie found him in the library that evening. The same place where he'd almost told her he loved her all those weeks ago. He was reading or pretending to when she walked in. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. If this is about the divorce, just tell me what you want. I'll sign whatever you need." His voice was so cold, so distant. Nothing like the warm, funny man she'd fallen in love with. "It's not about the divorce. It's about your grandmother." Something in her tone made him look up. Sophie sat down across from him and took a deep breath. "Your grandmother poisoned you," she said. "She's the reason you were dying." Daniel stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "What?" Sophie told him everything. The conversation she'd overheard. The evidence she'd gathered. The threats against Tommy. Why she'd pushed him away. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I lied to you. Sorry I hurt you. But I didn't know what else to do. She was going to destroy Tommy's treatment and I couldn't let her. But I also couldn't let you keep trusting someone who tried to kill you." Daniel sat frozen, his face white. "My grandmother tried to murder me." "Yes. And you've known for weeks." "Yes. Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I was scared." Sophie's voice broke. "I was scared she'd hurt Tommy. Scared she'd find a way to make me look like a liar. Scared of losing everything. I know I should have told you right away, and I'm sorry. But Daniel, everything I did because I love you. I've loved you for months. When I said I didn't, I was lying to protect you." Daniel stood up abruptly and walked to the window. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists. Sophie didn't know if he was angry at Catherine, or at the whole impossible situation. "Say something," she whispered. "Please." "I need to see the evidence," he said finally, his voice flat. Sophie showed him everything. The recordings, the documents, all of it. She watched his face as he listened to his grandmother casually discussing how she'd poisoned him, how she'd planned the whole thing. Watched him realize that the person who was supposed to love him most had tried to kill him for money and power. When the last recording ended, Daniel sat in silence for what felt like forever. "We need to go to the police," he said finally. "Tonight, your grandmother is powerful. She has lawyers. I have lawyers too, and now I have evidence." He turned to look at Sophie, really look at her for the first time in weeks. "You gathered all of this?" She nodded. "You risked everything to protect me, even after you thought I hated you. You don't deserve what she did to you. No one does." Daniel crossed the room and pulled Sophie into his arms. She collapsed against him, crying into his chest while he held her tight. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm sorry I made you face this alone. I'm sorry I was too hurt to see that something was wrong. You have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who lied. You lied to protect your brother and me. That's not the same as lying for selfish reasons." He pulled back to look at her face, wiping away her tears. "Did you mean it? When you said you love me?" "Yes, I've loved you for so long it hurts." "Good," Daniel said softly, "because I still love you too. Even when I was angry, even when I thought you didn't care, I never stopped loving you." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Sophie kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it. All the fear and love and hope for a future she'd thought was impossible. That night they went to the police together. Richard met them there with his own lawyer. They laid out everything, and by morning detectives were at the Westbrook mansion with a warrant for Catherine's arrest. Sophie watched from Daniel's car as his grandmother was led out in handcuffs. Catherine's face was a mask of rage, but there was something else there too. Shock. She'd never imagined that Sophie, the desperate little nurse she'd bought and paid for, would be the one to bring her down. The scandal was massive. It consumed the news for weeks. The Westbrook family imploded under the scrutiny. Cousins and aunts and uncles all scrambled to distance themselves from Catherine and her crimes. Through it all, Daniel and Sophie stood together. They gave statements to police, sat through depositions, faced down reporters and cameras. It was exhausting and terrifying, but they had each other. Catherine's trial took 6 months. The evidence was overwhelming. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, fraud, and a dozen other charges. She never apologized, never showed remorse, just glared at Sophie from across the courtroom like this was all her fault. When it was finally over, Daniel took Sophie's hand and led her out of the courthouse into the sunshine. "It's done," he said. "She can't hurt anyone anymore." "What happens now?" Sophie asked. Daniel smiled. "Now we get to figure out who we are when we're not living in crisis mode. We get to have a normal life, or as normal as possible." "I'd like that." 3 months later, Daniel asked Sophie a question. They were in the garden of a smaller house they'd bought together, far from the mansion and all its bad memories. "Will you marry me?" he asked, holding out a simple ring. Nothing like the massive diamond Catherine had forced on her. Just a plain gold band with a small sapphire. "Really marry me, I mean. Not because anyone's forcing you or paying you, just because you want to." Sophie laughed through happy tears. "We're already married. That was a business transaction. This is real. So what do you say, Sophie Chen? Will you be my wife? For real this time?" "Yes," she said, kissing him. "Yes, absolutely yes." They had a small ceremony a month later. Tommy was there, healthy and cancer-free, crying happy tears.